Hello and welcome to another update on my voxel engine. I have done some more work on it, so let's go ahead and get started. If I fire it up here, you'll notice it starts really quick. I have threaded chunk generation now, along with the geometry building, so that is something that's happened. And now I've bumped up the camera speed so I can demonstrate something here. If I move forward, you'll see that we now have infinite terrain generation. Now currently it keeps everything loaded in, but it would be fairly trivial to unload the chunks outside of the range when I get around to implementing that feature. But this is, as just a test, this seems to work pretty well. I've just implemented a method that every time the camera moves more than 16 units, then it attempts to queue everything in a 16 chunk radius for generation and or updating. But it seems to work pretty well. I have not noticed any actual issues with this, other than if you try and double queue voxel or double queue the chunks, it can seg fault on rare occasions, but I think there's a pretty easy fix for that if I just add a little check in there. So anyway, that's done. I redid the mesher yet again. If you'll notice, up in the top left, I have an FPS counter, which I've implemented with Nano VG along with the new, temporary crosshairs. But you'll notice I got an FPS counter up there, and even with all this stuff loaded, it's still solid 60. And I can go quite a long ways and generate quite a few chunks. At some point I'll add some more diagnostic information so you can see stuff like how many chunks are loaded. But it holds solid 60, and one of the main keys of doing this, and you can see it's actually dropping off the back of the clipping plane there. One of the main ways I was able to do this is I was able to condense the geometry quite a lot. And as of course you can still break and place voxels anywhere in the world. So yeah, so what I was able to do is, before I was doing a very, very, very inefficient way of storing this geometry. Each face you see is made of 2 triangles, which are made of 6 vertices total. And for each of those vertices, I was storing a separate floating point value for each dimension, the texture coordinates, the texture index, and every color of lighting. You know, I had a single floating point value for every single possible attribute that a point can have. And obviously I'm not using the lighting right now, it's just full bright. And I still have not actually implemented any real lighting. But I was able to pack most of this into 2 unsigned integers, other than the lighting, which is going to be packed all into 1. So it gets condensed from a bunch of floats down to basically 3. And what I've done is I've also made it faster to build. What it does is, instead of storing the absolute position of each vertex, for every face, it generates an offset that the texture index that it just automatically uploads to each point the exact same. So you just have to generate that offset once for each face, and then directly upload the rest of the geometry just from like a data structure somewhere. So that's what I've done with that. And then you just unpack it with bitwise operators in the shader. So I believe I'm using 5 bits to store the face offset, which should allow for 2 chunks worth of offset, and my plans for that I'll explain in a little bit. And then for the vertices within the actual voxel, it has 4 bits per dimension, so you can divide these up into 16 parts whenever you're making custom models of some sort. And then of course there will be facilities for making more detailed models than that, but those will probably be put into a separate rendering thing entirely. So anyway, like I was saying, my plans next are to be able to batch these chunks together, because I'm still doing a single draw call for every chunk, which is not terribly quick. And what I can do is I cache the geometry already. So what I can do is I can basically copy the memory back to back, then upload it into the buffer. So that way I can render 8 chunks with a single draw call. The only real performance hit with that is it'll take longer to upload the data to the GPU when a chunk is updated, but that's not currently a bottleneck. The bottleneck is much more draw calls than that. So it's a trade-off that I'm more than willing to take. So that is pretty much everything I've done. At some point here, I'm going to add back in like multiple textures, but that's an easy thing to do. I just haven't gotten to it. But I figured I'd go ahead and make a video since I've made some notable progress. And of course, you can see all the crazy terrain generation. Obviously, this is not going to be the final stuff at all. And, oh yeah, I guess one more thing on the infinite terrain generation. Currently, it just generates from 0 to 8 chunks, but in the future, I'm going to have it do kind of a flattened sphere where it'll generate chunks around the camera exclusively, and probably like 4 down, 4 up, and then you can have a radius around, and it'll just be kind of a flat circle, or a flat sphere. I guess that would be an oblate spheroid, if my geometry knowledge is correct. And as you can see, we're starting to get some frame droppage here, although I'm also recording, so that is certainly not helping. So that is pretty much everything I can think of that I've done, since these are unscripted. So until next time, have a good day.